Previously in this course, we have looked at just two gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now we're going to pivot and look at agents that we give patients to inhale with a therapeutic goal. These are anesthesia gases and vapors. Before we start that part of this series, I thought I would try and tie everything together in advance by trying to explain to you why it is that most anesthesia residents and even most of the attendings these days are only familiar with one volatile anesthetic, that's sevoflurane, and explain how we got to here. Fundamentals of Anesthesiology with me, Pat Nelligan. Understanding gases and vapors. How we got here. In this tutorial, we're going to look at what is anesthesia, anesthesia strategies, the history of volatile anesthetics, why sevoflurane reigns supreme, nitrous oxide as a second gas, and total IV anesthesia. What is anesthesia? Strangely, there are two spellings for this word, one with an A using the UK Anglosphere and one without the A. In these tutorials, I'm going to use the International English spelling for most things. Anesthesia is a controlled and reversible state in which sensation, with or without consciousness, is deliberately suppressed, most commonly using drugs to permit medical or surgical procedures. And there are three forms of anesthesia: local, where a small area is anesthetized; regional, where a large area is anesthetized; and general anesthesia. General anesthesia is a controlled and reversible state of anesthesia in which both consciousness and sedation are suppressed, resulting in unresponsiveness to surgical stimulation. The goal is a state where the patient is unconscious, does not experience or remember pain, and does not mount a harmful autonomic response to surgery. So we have hypnosis, amnesia, immobility, autonomic stability, and analgesia. Keep in mind that patients do not experience pain during anesthesia, but do mount an autonomic response to nociceptive activation. There are many key events in anesthesia history, but from our perspective, these are, in my view, the most important events. In the 1840s, ether was the first true general anesthetic agent, and that really ushered the era of inhalational anesthesia. Many agents subsequently followed, but modern agents are mostly derived from ether and its superstructure. In the 1950s and 1960s, bupivacaine arrived, and bupivacaine changed all of anesthesia forever because it was a long-acting local anesthetic agent that permitted both regional and neuraxial, that's spinal and epidural anesthesia, that could be used for relatively long cases. And finally, in the 1980s and early 1990s, propofol became available, and this drug, which is the most widely used anesthetic agent today, facilitated the era of total intravenous anesthesia. Bizarrely though, in this day and age, we have no universally agreed method or definition to quantify general anesthesia. We know it when we see it, but I am going to use an abbreviation ADA, adequate depth of anesthesia. That is sufficient inhalational agents or intravenous agents delivered to the patient to avoid awareness, recall, movement, and an adrenergic response. Now, because this particular series is on vapors and gases, I am going to focus on general anesthetic via the inhalational route. Let's start off with an idea of what true inhalational anesthesia looks like. So we're going to draw a graph. On the y-axis, we have depth of anesthesia going from 0, which is awake, to adequate depth of anesthesia with the dashed lines. And on the x-axis, we have time. So from ether onwards, where it was possible to deliver true general anesthesia, patients were given This particular agent, or all kinds of other agents that followed it, in particular halothane and sevoflurane, and patients were gassed to sleep. And this is what it looked like. Patients would gradually go asleep, there would be a bit of overshoot, and then they would be kept asleep at a specific level using some kind of a measurement, and there's all kinds of measurements, but only one truly accepted one, and that is the MAC, which we'll get into in huge detail in later tutorials. And then eventually the gas was turned off, the patient would exhale the gas, and they would eventually wake up. So that's pure inhalational general anesthesia. Do we do this? Yes, we absolutely do, particularly in children, and we probably always will do so in children. But for most patients, that's not how we deliver anesthesia. The alternative is to give pure intravenous anesthesia, where, for example, the patient is given propofol. There is rapid onset of action and rapid achievement of steady state, although sometimes it can be difficult to judge how much propofol is required. Often patients will get a depth of anesthesia monitor placed, such as a BIS monitor or a SED line. And for longer cases, the dose of the agent needs to be carefully weaned towards the end of the operation, or you'll have that embarrassing delay where the patient seems to be taking forever to wake up. But really nice, smooth anesthesia with a single agent, although rarely does a patient just get one intravenous agent. Most of the time these days, most anesthesiologists will add a second agent such as remifentanil, plus all kinds of analgesic agents also. But how most anesthetics are delivered worldwide is this way. The patient will be induced with a controlled dose of usually propofol or thiobarbiturate, and as soon as that patient achieves adequate depth of anesthesia, volatile anesthetic is delivered via the inhalational route. This necessitates a transition period where the induction agent is wearing off and the volatile agent is building up. And they must overlap at some point to ensure that adequate depth of anesthesia persists. Because the total amount of gas delivered is relatively modest once delivery stops and the agent is expired, the patient wakes up quickly and predictably. And the vast majority of anesthetics that I have ever given in my career have been delivered in this way. But that is not all we do. Just applying drugs that suppress consciousness are not enough. Let's draw a new graph. In this situation, the y-axis is catecholamine levels. That's adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. We will look at different timings. Preoperatively, during anesthesia, and then post-op. Let's see what happens. Preoperatively, the patient's catecholamines rise precipitously as the time of surgery nears, as they are very anxious, particularly younger adult patients. Then, during surgery, catecholamine levels surge due to the stress response. Post-op, the adrenergic response persists due to pain. All of this has a hugely negative impact on the body, on the cardiovascular system, on the neurohormonal system, and also on the ability of the body to stay in an anabolic state. With all of this epinephrine running around, the patient will start to burn off muscle mass very rapidly. So one of the major goals of anesthesia and anesthesiology is to curtail this hyperadrenergic response. How do we do this? First, by premedicating patients. This was always done in the history of anesthesia, not so much anymore because of all those preoperative site of surgery checks and World Health Organization checklists, and of course, the ease of walking the patients down to the operating room. So fewer and fewer patients are getting pre-meds these days. As a consequence, the anesthesiologists usually modulate this by giving the patient a small dose of, for example, midazolam or fentanyl to chill the patient out a bit, or just doing a snatch and grab rapid induction of anesthesia. Then, during the operation, anesthesia is delivered along with multimodal analgesia and then perhaps direct or indirectly acting antiadrenergic agents, and all of these analgesics and antiadrenergic agents may be prescribed into the postoperative period. Consequently, the catecholamine response is curtailed pre-incision, fully obliterated in the operating room, and then limited when it creeps back post-op. And all of this is achieved by a process known as multimodal analgesia. This sounds like something very simple, but it is not. Starting with local anesthetic into the wound site or the region, non-steroidals to reduce the inflammatory soup, opioids, acetaminophen, paracetamol, and perhaps ketamine to centrally modulate pain, alpha-2 adrenoceptor agonists such as clonidine or dexmedetomidine, or beta blockers to directly reduce adrenergic activity. Other agents may be used such as dexamethasone or magnesium, and a lot of anesthesiologists have their own personal cocktail. Some of this is evidence-based. A lot of this is just opinion and experience and art. And the reason why I make these points is that every anesthesiologist seems to believe that their way of delivering anesthesia is the best way, and they all have different cocktails. The hypnotic agent, whether it's volatile or intravenous, is only part of the perioperative pharmacologic, physiologic, and psychologic strategy that is used to minimize suffering. Small children usually require inhalational induction of anesthesia, but most patients get IV induction, and the pharmacological properties of volatile agents and their pros and cons is derived from inhalational induction studies, not combination studies. And so a lot of what we know about these agents that I'm going to move on to is based on gassing the patient down and doing various measurements, and not necessarily part of a multimodal anesthesia strategy. With this in mind, let's start looking at volatile anesthetic agents. For those of you who know little about chemistry, which seems to be most of my colleagues, on the left is a methyl group and on the right is an ethyl group. And the very first volatile anesthetic agent was diethyl ether, and it was delivered using the Boyle's bottle. Now, this was a phenomenal agent. It revolutionized surgery. It brought us into the modern era of medicine and surgery, but it had major flaws. Ether was associated with a very long time for onset and offset of action. That's going asleep and waking up, because it was very soluble in blood and tissues. There was a major risk of explosion because it is highly flammable. The dose was difficult to control. The patients coughed and they salivated, and generally the whole situation was really unpleasant. I think it's worth looking quickly at the timeline for the utilization of general anesthesia. There was a significant transatlantic divide. Soon after ether was introduced in the USA, chloroform emerged as the UK alternative. And for decades, there was a difference in practice. Ether is a much safer agent than chloroform, and I have been informed that this may well be the reason why in the UK and Ireland, anesthesia has always been delivered by doctors, where in the USA, a combination of doctors and nurse anaesthetists have practice. I also want to dispel a myth. No, you cannot put chloroform on a rag and abduct somebody like they do in pretty much every spy movie. It doesn't work like that. It takes forever to work. They cough and splutter and they wake up pretty fast afterwards, so they don't just lie in a coma. So let's just push that aside and see how things evolved. In the 1930s, hydrocarbons became popular. Cyclopropane in particular. It was a rapid-acting drug, but it's also highly flammable. Now, if you think back to that era, there was pretty much war all over the world, and there was a requirement for general anesthesia everywhere. And through the Second World War, ether reigned supreme. You could not have cyclopropane gas cylinders, which were quite explosive, lying around operating rooms. And although cyclopropane works really quickly, it fell out of favor because of this problem of flammability. And then in the 1940s and 1950s, we had the era of halogenated hydrocarbons. Trichloroethylene, very popular in the UK, not so popular in the USA. It's a really effective analgesic agent, but not a great anesthetic agent. But it really fell from favor when halothane emerged and it became hegemonic for a couple of decades. Again, halothane, fairly slow acting agent, and drug development then refocused on halogenated ethers, first methoxyflurane, then enflurane, isoflurane, sevoflurane, and desflurane. Let's have a quick look at the halogens. If you look at your periodic table, here are the halogens, group 9, fluorine, chlorine, and bromine. And the reason why halogen molecules were put into these volatile anesthetic agents was to increase stability, reduce solubility, and reduce flammability. So we had fluoride, chloride, and bromide. The first widely available and universally used halogenated anesthetics was called halothane. It's all in the name. It wasn't derived from ether, it's a halogenated hydrocarbon, and it contains bromide, fluoride, and chloride. First introduced in 1956, it was popular until the late 1990s, and my generation used it when we were junior doctors. It is non-flammable and non-pungent, so you get a very smooth induction and emergence. A little bit slow to work and wear off, sometimes that's not so bad, but it was limited by two things. In a very small proportion of patients, there was a possibility of liver injury. This was known as halothane hepatitis. And also, some patients underwent sensitization of the heart to catecholamines and developed intraoperative arrhythmias. Again, this was not that common, but there was a need to develop alternative agents, and this arose from modification of ether. The 1950s and 60s was a boom time for analog drug development, and while halothane was in development, labs all over the world worked frantically to develop alternative ether-like drugs using the underlying structure, but attempting to make it more stable by halogenating the methyl and ethyl chains, thus reducing solubility and flammability. So we started with methyl ethyl ether, and the drugs that followed this were halogenated ethers. The methyl group was, for all intents and purposes, the primary building block. The first agent to be released commercially was methoxyflurane, and this was a significant upgrade from ether and perhaps from the other agents that were available at the same time, dichloroethylene or cyclopropane, in that it was non-flammable and non-irritant to the airways. Over time, anesthesiologists discovered a hidden problem. Rather than being eliminated from the body directly from the lungs, up to 50% of methoxyflurane was metabolized, releasing fluoride ions. For most patients, this wasn't a problem because it's an extremely potent drug. You don't need a lot of this drug for anesthesia, but for very prolonged cases, the fluoride ions built up and patients could develop a nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. I never used or saw methoxyflurane while training in anesthesia. My entire knowledge of this drug was based on textbooks, and I've always seen it as a historical agent. Imagine to my surprise when one day I was in the ED and a patient came in on an ambulance puffing on one of these. This is a Penthrox device that contains methoxyflurane. Go figure. And it's now widely used in emergency medicine around the world except in North America. There are great reasons for choosing this drug in the emergency situation, as it has that great advantage of all anesthetics. You can give it by inhaling, get rid of it by exhaling. You don't need an IV, you don't need to be giving intramuscular drugs, and it's really easy to control the dose that's given because the patient controls it by how much they suck in and suck out. It has a really low saturated vapor pressure and a high boiling point, and as a consequence, it doesn't evaporate easily. It is highly potent, which means that very little is required, but it's not very soluble, so it is near impossible for patients to anesthetize themselves while puffing on it. It seems, and I have seen this in actuality, that those sub-anesthetic doses provide excellent analgesia. But in the operating room, methoxyflurane was replaced by enflurane in the mid-1960s, and subsequently by Isoflurane, which was a major upgrade from enflurane a few years later due to further halogenation. And the big advantage of isoflurane over enflurane was the degree of metabolism. We were right down to 0.2% metabolism at this stage, so extremely low possibility of the patient developing diabetes insipidus. For all intents and purposes, further modification of isoflurane brought us Desflurane in the 1990s. That removed the remaining chloride molecule and replaced it with fluoride. Desflurane is the most stable and least metabolized volatile anesthetic agent ever produced and marketed. It is unbelievably stable. It just does what it says it does. But it has a major limitation in that its boiling point is 22.8 degrees Celsius. It boils at room temperature, so it requires a special vaporizer. Not a big deal though. In and around the same time as Desflurane came in the mid-1990s, Sevoflurane was introduced. Initially we all went, what's the point here? Desflurane looks like the drug we're going to be using from now on. And it seemed to me that it was more of an evolution of enflurane rather than isoflurane, with a slightly different chemical structure and significantly more metabolism. And in many ways you would have thought, whoa, maybe this is a move backwards. And we were all scared to death of a metabolite that seemed to come out of it during its washing through soda lime known as compound A, although that turned out to be a big nothing. But if you look at the ideal volatile anesthetic agent, what do you want? You want something that has a rapid onset of action, something that's highly potent so you don't need a lot of it, so you're not continuously filling up the vaporizer, limited or no hepatic metabolism, so you don't want all that fluoride that damages the kidneys. You also don't want hepatic damage, limited tissue uptake, rapid elimination and wake up, and not pungent to inhale. So let's move back a bit to 1990, where we have isoflurane, and that is the boss anesthetic agent. This was the best drug ever invented at this stage. Everybody was either using it or wanted to use it, but it was a little bit expensive back then. But this was the state-of-the-art best anesthetic agent because it fulfilled most of these criteria. Rapid onset of action, pretty potent, virtually no metabolism, limited tissue uptake, rapid elimination and wake up, and reasonably non-pungent to inhale, but not as nice to inhale as enflurane, and certainly nothing like halothane. You could gas someone down with isoflurane, but it was pretty unpleasant. So along came Desflurane and Sevoflurane in about 1994, 1995. These drugs were seen as an evolution rather than a revolution. And if you look at Desflurane, there are certain things about it that are amazing. It is the most rapid onset of action drug that we have that gives full general anesthesia. Now, it's not potent, and you need to empty bottle upon bottle of this stuff into the vaporizer unless you use extremely low flow. It is completely non-metabolized for all intents and purposes. There is no uptake in tissues. Patients rapidly wake up, but it is a really pungent agent. It is possible to gas a patient down with Desflurane. It requires a huge amount of skill, and virtually nobody does this. The other problem with Desflurane is because of its pungency, if you are inaccurate with your anesthetic and the patient gets what we euphemistically call a little bit light, you can run into real problems because the patient will get into bronchospasm and laryngospasm. In comparison, Sevoflurane, not dissimilar onset of action, fairly rapid, quite potent. It does have a fair amount of metabolism, but probably not clinically significant. Limited tissue uptake, I'm not so sure. It seems to really soak into the tissues a lot, certainly as much, if not more, as isoflurane. Patients don't wake up all that quickly with Sevoflurane compared with, for example, Desflurane, but it is very sweet smelling. So you're asking yourself, why does Sevoflurane reign supreme now and has done so for the last 30 years? Why did Sevoflurane win the volatile anesthetic wars? Why did it so comprehensively defeat Desflurane. When they both came out at the same time, they were both heavily marketed and promoted. And the big difference was this: the pungency. This is the reason why everyone started using sevoflurane. Before 1995, halothane was the only volatile agent that could be used for gas induction. As soon as sevoflurane came along, everybody replaced it with sevoflurane. Although patients wake up slightly faster, particularly if they're obese, with desflurane, sevoflurane could be used for every single patient you had in the operating room. You did not need a second vaporizer. You certainly didn't need isoflurane, because sevoflurane and isoflurane were not all that different, except sevo could be used for gas induction. And finally, you did not need to refill that vaporizer as often as you did with desflurane. But keep in mind that in every other respect, apart from its lack of pungency, there is not a whole lot of difference between sevoflurane and isoflurane. It just was a more versatile agent, and that's why most anesthesiologists use it most of the time, and why most of our trainees have never used any other volatile anesthetic agent. Let's not forget nitrous oxide. Until 1995, the majority of anesthesiologists used nitrous oxide in addition to volatile agents to deliver anesthesia. Now, the major reason they did this, although most people wouldn't tell you at the time, was because we were using high flow circuits. Circle systems were only really coming in back then, certainly in the 1980s and early 1990s. And by giving nitrous oxide, which was dirt cheap, the amount of vapor required was significantly reduced. It was used as a second gas to reduce the amount of volatile agent that was required. But it also smoothens out anesthesia, leads to more rapid onset and offset of anesthesia because it is a highly insoluble drug. Now, there was a problem with nitrous oxide, and that was the possibility that people would forget to turn on the oxygen because it was given as a gas with a flow meter and they could give a hypoxic mixture. But that was resolved decades and decades ago by linking the two systems in newer machines. But the use of nitrous oxide gradually fell from favor over time for most anesthesiologists, particularly if they were using Desflurane. There wasn't much benefit from it, but it's still used quite widely to spare the amount of volatile given, also to aid with induction of anesthesia. And of course, it's used very, very widely on labor wards, and I will give you a full tutorial on nitrous oxide later in this series. So let's wrap all of this up. To understand inhalational anesthetics, you must understand why blood solubility is related to onset of action, that is the blood gas partition coefficient. To understand why lipid solubility is related to potency, the oil gas partition coefficient. To understand why tissue accumulation impacts emergence from anesthesia, the tissue blood partition coefficient. And to understand from all of this why a unifying but misleading concept, MAC, minimal alveolar concentration or median alveolar concentration, was developed and continues to have a hegemony for indicating depth of anesthesia. One last thought. Regardless of where you work or who is training you, you must understand the physical and pharmacological properties of volatile anesthetic agents. Even though total IV anesthesia can be used for virtually all patients, titrated from sedation to full general anesthesia, and it may be preferable in terms of sustainability, it is more difficult to monitor. It requires a good functioning IV line, and previously it required continuous availability of propofol, although we now have remimazolam as an alternative. If there are supply chain problems and you don't have propofol and all you do is TIVA, that's a problem. So we will talk about TIVA down the line, but this series is all about just vapors and gases. Let's review this tutorial. In this tutorial, we talked about what is anesthesia, anesthesia strategies, the history of volatile anesthetics, why sevoflurane reigns supreme, nitrous oxide as a second gas, and a brief mention of TIVA. Next time, we'll talk about the solubility of anesthetic gases and vapors in blood and plasma, the blood gas partition coefficient, solubility versus time of onset, Other factors that impact onset speed, the FA over FI ratio, overpressure, and steady state. I'll see you then, and I guarantee you'll learn something.